Still Wakes the Deep is a first-person psychological horror game made by the Chinese Room, a studio mainly known from their mod turned into fully fledged title, Dear Esther. That game is what's called a walking simulator, mainly because you walk around and explore an island while a story is told to you. The studio made a name for themselves by telling interesting stories with themes behind them for going actual gameplay. With that out of the way, let's talk about the disaster that struck an oil rig named the Beera D. It's December of 1975 and you play as Cameron McCleary, otherwise known as Kaz. Kaz is on the run from the police after beating a man within an inch of his life and has landed a job at an oil rig in the North Sea. Kaz received a letter from his wife Susan saying that if he doesn't come home soon, she'll take his 2 daughters and leave him. So Kaz does what any good husband does and just ignores her. Before the game really starts off, you get the opportunity to explore parts of the rig and speak with the crew, like Roy, a former alcoholic turned born-again Christian, who's also an old friend of Kaz and got him the job on the rig in the first place. I wish they had taken the opportunity to allow the player to get to know all of these characters, but all you get is this little intro section. I'll elaborate on that more in the spoiler section, but just know that you don't talk to all your crewmates enough to really care about them. The boss calls Kaz into his office after learning that the police are after him, fires him, and turns him into the authorities. But not before things go to hell.
Jesus, Gregor! Gregor! Get back, man! Guys, help me! Guys, don't let me die, man, please! I don't want to die! I don't want to die! Jesus, just hang on! Fuck! Fuck! Fuck!
The game runs on Unreal Engine 5 and it looks like it. Objects, textures, and post-processing effects really elevates everything to almost uncanny valley levels of realism. Until you look at some of the character models. Some of them look fine most of the time. Then you see them in darkness and how light bounces off of them, which thankfully really isn't that often. While we're on the subject of darkness, let's go ahead and address it. This game is dark. You don't fully realize it until you step into a lake for the first time. You do get a flashlight shortly after this scene and most of your fears can be put to rest. Most of them. Before we talk about the gameplay and monsters themselves, we gotta cover a few other things. One of the few things that the Chinese Room has consistently delivered on is the quality of their voice actors. Seeing as how the game is set off the mainland of Scotland, many of the voice actors are from the Isles of Skye, Dundee, Aberdeen, and Glasgow. It's all very thematic and works very well with getting you engrossed into the setting. If you plan on playing this for yourself, I highly recommend playing with subtitles on.
Oh, I can scalp in this hero by myself. No, we're alright. Cheers though. Fair enough.
Scottish and its many dialects are already hard to understand for most people. And when you throw in as much slang as they do here, you can easily get lost in the sauce when it comes to understanding what the fuck they're saying.
Oh, I'll stick to the lecky, thanks. No great in tight spaces and it's blowing a gale out there.
As for the environmental sound design, it's also very well done. Everything from the bows of the Beera D to the main platform of the rig itself all have audio character of their own to make each section feel unique.
What is that?
This gets amplified when the weather outside the rig starts to get worse.
Can I fucking stand this cold? Jesus.
This all gets tied in together well with the ambient soundtrack that knows when to fade in and out as you explore. Now granted, most of it will be missed because of how not in your face it is, and since the game does like to go into absolute silence at points, it can be hard to recognize that it's there at all. There's also good tension music in places where you know you're already not safe. Just to add that little bit more of unease. Then when the chase is on, it's on. At one point, the sounds worked so well it actually sounded like a monster was actually behind me during a chase sequence, until I looked behind me and saw that they were in a different zip code entirely, which does ruin the illusion of it being right behind you, but it's still effective nonetheless. As mentioned earlier, the game takes place on an oil rig named the Replayability, and honestly, it's a perfect setting for a horror game. You're in the middle of the North Sea, isolated with no way to escape. The realization that there's no way off the rig sets in really quickly. The dev team interviewed oil rig workers and accessed archives to get the Replayability as right as they could, and it feels like a legitimate oil rig from top to bottom. As you're exploring, you'll navigate your way through crew quarters, engineering, and some of the legs that keep the oil rig afloat. It's all well done and feels like a real place. With that being said though, there's not that many places you can actually explore. You'll be replaying areas several times during your playthrough, but it's not all bad. As the game progresses, parts of the oil rig will become mangled and impossible to traverse. So although you are running through the same areas, they will become different upon each visit, so it won't feel like you're backtracking. When starting the game, you have the option of picking between story mode and standard mode. Story mode is more along the lines of a walking simulator, ensuring that the player experiences the story without ever really being challenged. Standard is more along the lines of a walking simulator, ensuring that the player experiences the story without ever being, wait, what? So if you know the Chinese room, you know that their focus is the storytelling rather than gameplay. If you've played Dear Esther or Amnesia Machine for Pigs, you'll already know this going in. What's unfortunate is that, like in Machine for Pigs, they've forgone actually challenging players in order to tell you their story, which sounds good for a Chinese room game, but this is their second try at a horror title and they failed again. It's pretty bad. Either way, I only ever played on standard difficulty, and I promise you, if you've played other video games, you can make it to the end without dying. Now, this game does have standard mechanics you'd expect to see in a horror game. Crouching, leaning, and sprinting are all there and they function. You can hide in wall lockers, which is never needed, honestly. I did it once because I thought I had to, but no, I just sat there and waited on nothing to happen. If there are no wall lockers in sight, you can just freely walk into a little hidey hole and hide in there. If there's nowhere to hide, you also have the option of throwing items to distract enemies. On top of that, there is no combat, so you do have to be careful not to be spotted. So all that stuff's good and what you would want in a horror game. So why not add climbing sections into the game? How about crawling on the pipes? Or hell, why not fit into ridiculously small spaces like you're that one guy from the X-Files? Fuck it, let's add the protagonist squeezes through tight space to load level sequence. Over and over and over again, because I'm sure gamers love this. I'm so sick of seeing games do this. Here it's doubly worse because the levels aren't that large and you load in and out of them. So yeah, they added a bunch of other movement mechanics that honestly weren't needed. Now there are swimming sections which I think are purely there to play on the fear of drowning, but they're really just annoying. I would have been fine with the bare minimum crouch, lean, sprint if it meant we got more in-depth monster encounters. Speaking of which,
Jesus fucking Christ!
the monster designs are a mixed bag. All the monsters were crewmates that were somehow or another transformed into beings actively hunting you. They're pretty neat and mimic the designs of John Carpenter's The Thing. What's really off-putting about them is that the monsters are in some way still people. You'll hear them cry out or belittle other crewmates or Kaz as they're hunting you. which is pretty neat, but the way they're underutilized is so unfortunate that they're not even fun enemies. They're so few and far between and level specific. What's worse is that they're not an ever-present threat, and they telegraph their presence way before you see them, and they're so easily manageable. It's honestly kind of embarrassing, but like I said before, they want you to see the story they've written instead of noping out before you see the end. I'm not saying that the game isn't scary or anything, because there were one or two parts where I was genuinely scared to progress. But unfortunately, that feeling didn't last long and I kept moving on. All in all, it's a walking simulator with barely gameplay and a few levels that require AI manipulation. Once you finish the game, you're taken back to the main menu to start all over again or to replay the credits. As I mentioned earlier, there are only 2 difficulties starting out, and unfortunately, there's no bonus hard or nightmare mode that unlocks after you've completed the game. Which is a good thing considering how that's a fucking dumb idea, but either way, this is what you got. The most egregious thing about the entire game is that the experience only lasts 4 hours. Now, typically, most people are tired of the gameplay loop of a survival horror fairly quickly. You can only hide in a locker and play hide and seek for so long before you get bored. A developer's job is to keep the player tense for as long as possible to delay that boredom from setting in sooner rather than later, with the ultimate goal of players making it to the end while still engaged in the gameplay loop. Doing this ensures that the game can be longer while not relying on any other form of padding. Here, however, because of the lack of and engagement of the gameplay it presents, it's almost a benefit that the game is criminally short, because by the time you make it 2 or maybe 3 hours in, you're sick of playing it and are ready for it to be over. Polish-wise, the game is functional and I never experienced any sort of crash. With that being said, some objects and physics can be a bit buggy, and honestly, this is the only instance I saw of any jank. So expect it not to shit the bed before you reach the end. Before we get into the story, there's something important you need to know. This game was not made by the same Chinese room who made Dear Esther and A Machine for Pigs. In 2017, the studio directors laid off the entire staff, which only consisted of about 8 people at the time. Dan Pinchbeck, co-director and lead writer for the Chinese room since 2012, stayed and worked on smaller projects as the studio was being acquired by Sumo Group in 2018. Now the studio has over 100 employees which are working on multiple projects at a time. So with that being said, even though we don't have the original team that gave us Dear Esther, at least we have the writer, so there should be some good storytelling here, right? No. Dan Pinchbeck wrote the story for Still Wakes the Deep and left the studio in the summer of 2023. I sent him an email asking if working with essentially a new studio got in the way of any sort of storytelling. And at the time of this review, he hasn't played the game, so we won't get a definitive answer soon. So the story is either word of God how it's supposed to be, or some rewrites happened after Dan left. With all the background stuff out of the way, go to here if you don't want to see the spoilers. Let's back up a bit so I can make a point really quick. As I mentioned earlier, in the beginning of the game, you go through some of the common areas to get a quick introductory to the characters that work on the oil rig. The problem here is that you really don't know these people. Kaz, the player character, knows them, but you don't. So when some of them inevitably die, it's really hard to even care. It would have mattered more if they had waited a while to get you more acquainted with each character individually before killing them, but they didn't do that. Which is a shame because the voice acting here is excellent at conveying the emotions of losing friends. But if the player isn't emotionally invested, it's an impossible feeling to convey. This will come up again later, I promise. Anyway, you're pulled back onto the rig to see that it has struck something otherworldly. You see that whatever it is destroying the oil rig. I love it when horror games introduce you to a perfectly fine world just to destroy it right in front of you. I personally prefer this rather than going into somewhere after shit's already hit the fan. After seeing some of the destruction, you get your first monster encounter.
I'm staying back, okay?
Well, sort of. He actually isn't in this room, but man, I was freaked out when I thought he was in the room with me. So with the rig being destroyed and people getting turned into monsters, it's time to evacuate. Kaz runs into Roy and they decide that they're not going to wait for the oil rig manager, Rennick, to give the evacuation order. Kaz makes his way to the lifeboats to find out that they're all fucked. Then gets a call from Rennick telling him to get to the helipad and bring anyone he finds along with him. On your way back to Roy, you find your first real threat. One of your crew members has been turned and he's right in the way of where you need to go. I tried sneaking around him and it seemed like it was working, but I think our paths just crossed perfectly and he caught me anyway. After that nightmare, Roy tells you that he needs his insulin and can't get to it. Kaz tries talking him up to go get it for himself, but we're not sure if he actually does it. Either way, Kaz leaves him to go hold the helicopter for other survivors for as long as he can. The next section requires you to sneak past Muir, another crew member turned monster. It's kind of sad how easy his sections are. You go from one hidey hole to another and that's really it for him. Once you get up to the helicopter pad, it goes about as well as you expected.
Die here. Christ. Zeus. Come on. Come back. Hey!
So now that the helicopter is fucked and the electricity is on the fritz, you have to go and fix it. Kaz knows of a shortcut through administration that will take him to engineering, so we take that shortcut. This absolutely unexpected chase sequence will catch people off guard and it's honestly fun. Unfortunately, this monster and its design can only be found in chase sequences, which is a real shame. Once you get to engineering, Finley is there waiting to give you instructions while Adair hunts for you. He's highly alert to sound, so you know what that means. Believe it or not, he is the last monster type. Him and the others show up throughout the game, and once you know their shtick, they're no longer a real challenge. So again, they want you to see their story rather than actually being challenged. Once that's over, you get a call from Brody telling you that the rig is sinking and that you have to make your way to the pontoons to keep it afloat. You do just that and meet a familiar face along the way.
You can hear me, can you? You understand me? Fucking Jesus.
And make it back to the main platform. Shortly after that, you get a call from good old Roy. He still hasn't gotten his insulin and is running out of time. You meet up with Brody, who explains to you that there's a gas leak that needs to be rerouted before the entire rig blows up. This is one story beat I do enjoy about the game. The survivors are doing everything they can to keep the rig from sinking or killing them. It really puts into perspective how important each one of the crew members' jobs were. Anyway, once that catastrophe is averted, you go below deck and meet up with Finley and Brody. Now the rig is tilting over and you and Brody have to go and fix that problem. Not only that, but gas is leaking into the rig now, adding more stress to the situation. While all of this is being explained, Roy gets on the intercom and is becoming obtundant. He really needs his fucking insulin.
Diabetes.
After this conversation, you go to find Roy's insulin before it's too late.
Roy, talk to me, big man. Come on, Roy. Roy, wake up, you prick. Please wake up. Wake up, come on.
This is why I've harped on the game for not getting us all that well acquainted with really any of the characters of the BRD. This could have been a much more powerful scene if we, the players, were more emotionally invested into not only Roy, but everyone else. You can hear the voice actor giving his best performance, but it doesn't matter. We've all had fictional characters we've been emotionally attached to, and when they meet their demise, it genuinely leaves an imprint one way or another. But here, it just falls flat. So when people say that there's a great story here with amazing gameplay, I have to question if either their standards have been lowered by modern gaming, or if they're even playing the same game as I am. Eventually, you make your way back to Finley and discover that Brody is stuck in one of the pontoons he was fixing. You listen to him die over the phone, and again, we get a powerful and terrifying scene involving a character's death that we're just not attached to. Finley becomes convinced that the monsters are a result of an infection that will take over the world. She goes to cause the very explosion Brody warned you about and gets owned. Before she dies, she convinces you of the same line of reasoning and you go to destroy the rig. Once you do that, you flow through space as Kaz's soul ascends to the heavens while he recollects key moments in his life. The game ends with a flashback before you leave to board the BRD in the first place, and Susan writing a letter saying that she wants Kaz to come home and she'll stick it out and not get a divorce. Too bad Kaz is fucking dead. Did I skip over a ton of story? Not really. A lot of the dialogue is either characters telling you to fix things or of characters dying. I would love to sit here and tell you about how each and every one of these characters were important to keeping the rig afloat and what their purpose was on the rig and what their fates were as the ship went down. But the developers didn't invest time in the characters in what feels like a character-driven story. I cannot fathom how review sites are praising this story, let alone the game as a whole. It's simply an A to B story with no underlying themes or real character development. Coming off of the Bendy series, I'm honestly shocked that a studio that's known for its storytelling is being outdone by a game studio who just made a parody of Mickey Mouse. I'd forgive the gameplay if the story was immaculate, but it's dog shit. I'd forgive the story if the gameplay was fun and engaging, but it's subpar at best. The devs had a perfect setting for a truly terrifying game, and instead of a truly horrifying story, we get weird alien bad guy stuff backed by a boring plot. Imagine this game without the parkour, better character development, based around the murderer on the BRD, while a storm is raging preventing them from escaping. You could spend the days getting to know the crew members as they slowly get picked off one by one, and during night fix whatever problems the saboteur is causing. During all of this, the crew starts to question and accuse each other, leaving you to pick sides, eventually finding the killer and escaping. All of what I just said was me talking aloud when evaluating this game for the first time right after I had finished it. This shit is not hard to figure out, and I'm impressed more than anything when studios fuck up this badly. I'm done. I'm just done with this shit. It still wakes the deep a good game. Honestly, no. Looking at it as a traditional video game, it's very lackluster with its mechanics, and honestly, it's just plain boring most of the time. Looking at it as a walking simulator, the story provided has no depth beyond what's surface level. Every character development is spoon-fed to you, and the supporting cast isn't that interesting either because they weren't expanded upon. The Chinese Room, a studio known for making walking simulators, failed at making a walking simulator. Should you give it a try? No. There's no underlying message or unique ideas being explored here. There's no memorable characters or story beats that'll leave an impression either. This title offers a whole lot of nothing while having the audacity to have a $35 price tag for a 4-hour experience, which honestly is fucking criminal. I've spoken about wasted potential on the channel before, and this may be one of the worst examples of a developer not developing a title to its fullest potential. Still Wakes the Deep is a title made by a studio made famous for their stories it tells, but rather than writing an engaging story with memorable characters, they instead fully relied on the setting alone without much effort into anything else. Couple that with a combination of barely gameplay and wanting to be a walking simulator, this was doomed to be the disaster that struck the BRD. What do you think is a good example of mascot horror? I never knew this was a genre, so that explains a few things. Honestly, I don't think there is one. For context, I've only played the first 3 Five Nights at Freddy's games, but never beat any of them. But I have beaten Choo Choo Charles and the Bendy series. So any other games that fall into this category, I probably haven't played. All of these games are lacking in one way or another. They either look like dog ass, play like dog ass, or are just a waste of time. Everything post Five Nights at Freddy's feels like a cash grab, and that's really a shame. Thanks for stopping in, and have a good Freedom Day, folks.